Reverb is the confluence of taste and technical ability coming together to create a sonic signature that's unique to each mixing engineer. If you're new here, my name's Jacob, and I've been running a commercial recording studio for 5 years. When we're developing our tastes utilizing reverbs and mixes, we all want to have good taste. When I take a step back and I think about what's good in records, I think about often what's familiar in records. To develop good taste, we need to first understand what's familiar so we can deliver something good to the listener, and then we can expand on what's familiar to create something unique to us, and that's going to create your own individual taste. And so we're going to do that today through 3 reverb tips. And the first one I want to talk about is utilizing aux sends for your reverbs. And everyone's going to tell you to use an aux send, but let's talk about why we should use an aux send. The first reason you're always going to hear is that it's going to give you more flexibility, and that first thing everyone likes to focus on is the dry-wet flexibility you have with each reverb. But most plugins can give us that now on an insert level, so why not just put that reverb on the individual track? Well, you'll learn through your mixing career that oftentimes engineers will put one reverb on the verse, a different reverb on the chorus, maybe another reverb on the bridge, and maybe an effect reverb or a special reverb on certain phrases or elements within the mix. And so if we're putting 5 reverb plugins on our vocal along with our vocal chain, it's going to get really disorganized. You can even create multiple aux tracks to keep it organized when you're using all your different reverbs across your mix. So to create an aux track, there's a couple different ways you can do it. This is the way I like to do it. We're going to click on the send. We're going to go to new track, and it's going to automatically make it a stereo aux input, and then we can label it. And so if I wanted to create familiarity in my mix, I may ask myself, okay, what reverbs were the pros using that came before me? And things come to mind like a Lexicon 224, an EMT 250, maybe even a chamber style reverb that recreates the sound of a speaker being in a room that's mic'd up. And so those first 2 examples, the Lexicon 224 and the EMT 250, are some of the earliest examples of digital reverbs. We can look back at what limitations did those reverbs have, and we can implement those limitations on our reverbs to create this familiar kind of pro record analog sound. Lots of buzzwords right there. And one of the technical limitations of both of those reverbs was the frequency response. A Lexicon 224 tops out around 8 kilohertz and the EMT 250 tops out around 10.8 kilohertz. Meaning there's not a lot of high frequency information happening on these really classic reverbs. So if we want something to have that pro record sound, maybe we'll take off that high end. And doing that may be perceived as familiar to the listener if that fits within the style that you're trying to mix. Let's take a listen to the legendary Lexicon 224. I'm going to start off with no reverb and then we'll bring it in.
Ven a los lugares escondidos de mi corazón, donde ves todos mis deseos, todo lo que anhelo. Tú nunca te olvidas de mí.
I'm going to bring it up a little bit too much.
Todos mis deseos, todo lo que anhelo. Tú nunca te olvidas de mí. Oh no, tú nunca te olvidas.
When I think of a Lexicon reverb, I think it sits really nice underneath the vocal, and that can be attributed to its limited frequency response. With that roll off around 8 kilohertz, it's not going to shine brighter than the vocal, so it's really nice at sitting underneath the vocal and keeping the vocal glued into the song. And the next thing I want to talk about is the Abbey Road reverb trick. And that works by putting a filter before your reverb. And putting that filter before your reverb, as I'll show you in just a moment, is going to clean up the low end of the reverb, but also it's going to react similarly like the Lexicon, having that reduced frequency response in the high end to sit really nicely underneath the vocal. Let's first add our filter. And this is on the aux. Obviously, we're not affecting the main track itself. We're sending the track to this aux channel, which is then being filtered. Again, thinking back to what types of reverbs were engineers using when they were using the Abbey Road reverb trick, they would be using something like a chamber. So to fit the theme even more, I'm going to try out a chamber reverb. So first, again, dry vocal, and then we'll go into the chamber reverb sound with no filter, and then I'll engage the filter.
Ven a los lugares escondidos de mi corazón, donde ves todos mis deseos, todo lo que anhelo. Tú nunca te olvidas de mí. Tú ves todos mis deseos, todo lo que anhelo. Tú nunca te olvidas.
Using the Abbey Road's reverb trick is very subtle, but it cleans up your reverb in a really nice way. And so now, let's see what happens if we create a blend between the Lexicon and this chamber reverb we have between our two accents. So let's start with the Lexicon.
Ven a los lugares escondidos de mi corazón, donde ves todos mis deseos, todo lo que anhelo. Tú nunca te olvidas de mí. Tú ves todos mis deseos, todo lo que anhelo. Tú nunca te olvidas de mí. Ven a los lugares escondidos de mi corazón, donde ves todos mis deseos, todo lo que anhelo. Tú nunca te olvidas de mí. Tú ves todos mis deseos, todo lo que anhelo. Tú nunca te olvidas de mí. Oh no, tú nunca te olvidas de mí.
So now you can see we were able to create this beautiful, lush reverb soundscape using reverbs and techniques from all across recording history, starting with the Lexicon, then going back in time and using the Abbey Road reverb trick, and then applying something more modern like the wet reverb. If you notice, when I first engaged the wet reverb, the filter automatically rolls off the high end at about 9K, and that's reminiscent of an early digital reverb. So I just came in and rolled off the low end a little bit, similar to the Abbey Road reverb trick, because we've got a lot of reverb going on in this track. We don't want it to get muddy too quick. And so by looking to the past to see what professional mixing engineers did before us, we can implement similar tools or similar techniques to create a similar feeling of professionalism in our mixes. And once we understand how these reverbs or tools were used historically, we can then expand on that to create a sonic signature that's truly our own.